Isaiah had no idea that walking into his wife's office that afternoon would be the moment everything changed.
She's actually in a meeting right now. Maybe I should let her know you're...
It's fine, yeah. I'll just pop my head in. I promise I won't stay long.
Isaiah, you should have called first.
He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. My name is Isaiah Cross. I'm 35 years old, and for 8 years, I ran a small auto repair shop on the edge of downtown, the kind of place with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door that still rings the same way it did the day I bought the building. I've had grease under my fingernails since I was 16. My father taught me this trade before he passed, and I never once felt like it was beneath me. I built something with my hands. I fixed what was broken. There's a kind of honesty in that work that I never found anywhere else. My wife Vanessa didn't see it that way, not toward the end at least. Vanessa and I met in college, back when she was still figuring out who she wanted to become, and I already knew exactly who I was. She used to love that about me, the certainty, the steadiness. She used to say I was the calmest person she'd ever met, that being around me felt like exhaling after holding your breath too long. We got married 2 years after graduation, in a small ceremony neither of our families could really afford, and for a while we built something quiet and good together. Then Vanessa's career took off. She'd always been brilliant, sharper than anyone in any room she walked into, and within a few years she climbed from junior analyst to founding her own consulting firm, Ashcroft Vale Partners, which grew faster than either of us expected. By year 6 of our marriage, she was CEO of a company worth tens of millions of dollars, moving through rooms full of investors and executives who spoke a language I never fully learned to speak myself. I want to be honest about something. I was proud of her. Genuinely, completely proud in a way that never once curdled into resentment, no matter what people might assume about a man in my position. What I didn't realize, not for a long time, was that her success had started reshaping how she saw me, not as her equal anymore, but as something she needed to explain away. It started small. She stopped inviting me to company events, telling me they'd be boring, that I wouldn't know anyone there. Then she started introducing me differently at the events I did attend, not as my husband, Isaiah, he owns an auto shop, but as my husband, Isaiah, he's in the automotive industry, like the vagueness itself was a kindness she was doing me. I noticed. I didn't say much about it, not because I didn't care, but because I loved her. And love has a way of making you generous with people's flaws long after you should probably stop being. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I'd finished an early job and found myself with a rare free afternoon, so I decided to surprise Vanessa at her office. Something I hadn't done in almost 2 years, mostly because she'd made it clear, in the careful, diplomatic way she said most uncomfortable things, that she preferred me not to just show up without calling first. I told myself that Tuesday I wasn't going to overthink it. I bought her favorite coffee from the place 2 blocks from her building and took the elevator up to the 40th floor, feeling something close to nervous excitement, the way you do when you're about to do something a little bit romantic and a little bit out of character. Her assistant, a young woman named Priya who I'd met a handful of times, gave me a strange, hesitant look when I told her I wanted to surprise Vanessa in her office. "She's actually in a meeting right now," Priya said, glancing toward the closed frosted glass doors of Vanessa's corner office. "Maybe I should let her know you're—" "It's fine," I said, smiling. "I'll just pop my head in. I promise I won't stay long." I should have listened to the hesitation in Priya's voice. I didn't. I opened the door quietly expecting to see Vanessa mid-presentation, maybe a small group of executives around her conference table. Instead, the office was nearly empty, just Vanessa, standing close to a man I recognized as Preston Hale, the polished, always impeccably dressed business partner she'd mentioned more times over the last year than I'd fully registered until that exact moment. They weren't looking at documents. They weren't discussing strategy. They were kissing, slow and unhurried, like people who'd done this so many times it had become comfortable, familiar, unremarkable to them. I didn't say anything right away. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few seconds, holding a paper cup of coffee that suddenly felt absurd in my hand. Vanessa pulled back first. She looked at me not with panic, not with the scrambling shame I might have expected from someone caught in the middle of betraying her husband. She looked at me the way you look at an interruption, mildly inconvenienced, composed even then. "Isaiah," she said, smoothing the front of her blazer, her voice even and controlled, "you should have called first." I don't remember exactly how long I stood there. Long enough for the silence to stretch past uncomfortable into something else entirely, something closer to clarity. "You should have called first," Vanessa said again, when I didn't respond the first time. Her voice hadn't wavered. If anything, it had steadied further, like she was recalibrating in real time, deciding how to manage this the way she'd manage any unexpected variable in a boardroom. I looked at Preston. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away, straightening his jacket with a small, controlled motion, the kind of gesture a man makes when he wants to appear unbothered but isn't quite as composed as he'd like to seem. He didn't apologize. He didn't say anything at all. I got the sense, standing there, that silence was simply his strategy, that speaking would require acknowledging something he'd rather leave unacknowledged. "How long?" I finally asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected, though I could feel my pulse in my ears. Vanessa's jaw shifted slightly. "Isaiah, this isn't the place." "How long, Vanessa?" She glanced at Preston, then back at me, and something in her expression hardened, like she decided continuing to dodge the question was more effort than it was worth. "A little over a year," she said, flat, almost clinical, like she was reporting a quarterly earnings figure rather than the demolition of 8 years of marriage. A little over a year. I did the math without meaning to. Birthdays, anniversaries, the quiet Tuesday nights I'd spent waiting for her to come home from client dinners. The weekend, she'd told me, she needed a solo trip to clear her head before a big product launch. All of it recalculating in front of me, every memory reshaping itself into something I hadn't understood while it was happening. "I never once made you feel like I wasn't proud of you," I said. It wasn't really a question. It was the only thing I could think to say that felt true. Something flickered across her face then, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it, something she pushed down almost as quickly as it appeared. "This isn't about pride, Isaiah." "Then what is it about?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had lost some of its earlier composure, replaced by something rawer, something I hadn't heard from her in years. "It's about needing someone who exists in the same world I do now," she said. "Someone I don't have to explain. Someone who understands what it means to build something at this level, who isn't going to look at me like I've become a stranger every time I talk about my day." "I never looked at you like a stranger." "You didn't have to," she said. "I felt like one anyway. Every room I walk into, every deal I close, every version of myself I've had to become to get here, none of it made sense to you. You still talk about torque specs and timing belts like they're the most important things in the world, Isaiah, and I love that about who you used to be, but I'm not that person anymore, and I got tired of pretending the gap between us didn't exist." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to say I felt only anger, only betrayal, and leave it at that. But underneath all of it was something quieter and more devastating. A kind of grief for a version of my marriage I'd apparently been living alone, believing in a partnership that Vanessa had already started dismantling, piece by piece. a year before I ever knew to grieve it. You could have told me, I said, instead of this. Told you what, Isaiah? That I outgrew you. The words landed harder than anything else she'd said, and I don't think she meant them to sound as cruel as they did, but cruelty doesn't require intention to leave a mark. I looked at Preston one more time, still silent, still composed, a man comfortable existing in the wreckage of someone else's marriage as long as it didn't require him to speak. Then I looked back at Vanessa, at the woman I'd loved since we were 22 years old, standing in an office that represented everything she'd built without me, telling me, in the calmest voice I'd ever heard her use, that I'd become something she'd simply outgrown. I set the coffee cup down on the edge of her desk, careful, deliberate, the same way I'd handle any piece of equipment I didn't want to damage on my way out. I'll have my lawyer contact yours, I said. I turned and walked out of that office without raising my voice, without breaking a single thing, without giving either of them the satisfaction of watching me come apart. I made it all the way to the parking garage before my hands started shaking. The divorce was finalized 4 months after that day in Vanessa's office. I didn't fight for the house. She'd bought it with company money before we separated, and by then I understood there wasn't much point in fighting for things that had already stopped feeling like mine. I kept the shop, my truck, and a modest one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat 2 blocks from work. It wasn't much, but it was mine outright, and there was something steadying about that in a season of my life when very little else felt steady. People assume heartbreak makes you fall apart in dramatic ways. For me, it mostly just made me quiet. I worked longer hours than I needed to, not because business demanded it, but because the shop was the one place where everything still made sense, where a problem had a clear cause, and if you were patient and paid attention, you could always find your way to a solution. Marriages didn't work that way, I'd learned. Engines did. I didn't hear much from Vanessa after the papers were signed. Occasionally, a mutual acquaintance would mention her name. Ashcroft Vale Partners had expanded into 2 new markets. She'd been featured in a business magazine. She and Preston were apparently still together, now attending events publicly as a couple. I let the information pass through me without holding on to it. I want to be honest and say that took real effort in the beginning. It got easier with time, the way most things do when you stop feeding them your attention. My father used to say that a man's character shows most clearly in how he treats people who can't do anything for him. I thought about that a lot during those months, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because it was one of the only pieces of him I still had left to hold on to, now that the life I'd built around his teachings had come apart at the seams. I kept working the way he taught me. Fair prices, honest diagnoses, never charging someone for a repair they didn't actually need, even when I knew they wouldn't have known the difference. It was a Thursday afternoon in late autumn when everything shifted, though I had no way of knowing that at the time. A car pulled up outside the shop that didn't belong on our street. A vintage 1967 Aston Martin, deep British racing green, immaculately restored, the kind of car you see in magazines rather than parked outside a modest repair shop wedged between a laundromat and a discount grocery store. The engine was making a sound I recognized instantly, a worn timing chain complaining under load, the kind of problem that could strand a car like that in the middle of nowhere if left untreated. The man who stepped out was probably in his early 60s, silver-haired, dressed simply for someone driving a car worth more than most houses. A plain gray sweater, dark trousers, no visible jewelry except a wedding band. He introduced himself as Julian Whitfield, apologized for showing up without an appointment, and explained that his usual mechanic was 3 hours away, and the car had started making a troubling noise on his drive through the city. I didn't recognize the name at the time. I found out later, from a customer who came in the next week practically vibrating with disbelief, that Julian Whitfield had quietly built and sold 2 technology companies over the past 2 decades and was worth somewhere north of $2 billion, a fact he apparently guarded as closely and unpretentiously as the classic car he drove. None of that mattered to me that afternoon. What mattered was the sound the engine was making, and the fact that a beautiful piece of machinery needed someone who cared enough to fix it properly instead of rushing the job. I spent nearly 3 hours on that Aston Martin, more time than the job technically required, because cars like that deserve patience, and because Julian Whitfield turned out to be easy company. He sat in the shop's small waiting area reading a paperback novel, occasionally wandering over to watch me work, asking genuinely curious questions about the timing chain, the compression ratios, the specific challenges of maintaining an engine that old. He didn't perform interest the way some wealthy customers do, filling silence with condescension disguised as friendliness. He just seemed like a man who liked understanding how things worked, the same way I did. "You've got good hands," he told me, as I finished tightening the last bolt and wiped the grease from my fingers. "And more patience than most people. I pay a great deal of money to be patient." I told him it was just the job done right. He smiled at that in a way that made me think he didn't hear that answer very often. He paid in full, tipped generously despite my protest, shook my hand with a firm, genuine grip, and drove off into the early evening light with his engine running smoother than it probably had in years. I closed up the shop an hour later, tired in the good, honest way physical work leaves you tired, and it wasn't until I was doing my final walkthrough, checking that every bay was clear, that I noticed something small and dark lodged between the passenger seat's leather cushion and the center console. Something Julian Whitfield had apparently forgotten, sitting on the workbench where he'd emptied his pockets before getting under the hood to watch me work. A small, worn leather box, the hinges soft with age. Inside it, resting on faded velvet, was a woman's wedding ring. I sat with that ring in my hand for a long moment before I understood why it stopped me the way it did. It wasn't an especially large diamond, nothing flashy or ostentatious, which surprised me given who it apparently belonged to. It looked old, older than modern engagement settings, the kind of ring you'd expect to see passed down rather than purchased new. The band was worn thin in places, the way metal wears when it's been on someone's hand through decades of ordinary life, not just special occasions. I understood immediately that this wasn't something I could simply mail back or leave for him to notice was missing on his own. A man doesn't accidentally carry a ring like that in his pocket. This was something he meant to keep close, something that mattered enough to travel with him even on an ordinary Thursday drive through the city. I didn't have a way to reach him directly. He'd paid in cash, hadn't left a phone number, and my records only had the make and model of the car, not an owner's contact information. I asked around the shop that week, mentioned it to a few regular customers, and eventually one of them, the same man who'd told me about Julian's business background, mentioned that Whitfield kept a private office downtown, unmarked, deliberately difficult to find, exactly the way a man who valued privacy over visibility would prefer it. It took me 4 days to track down the address, and even then I almost didn't go. Part of me wondered if it would look strange, showing up uninvited at a billionaire's private office holding a piece of jewelry he might assume I'd taken rather than found. But my father's voice kept returning to me in those quiet moments of doubt. A man's character shows most clearly in how he treats people who can't do anything for him. And I understood, sitting with that ring in its worn leather box, that returning it wasn't optional. It was simply the kind of man I was going to be, regardless of what it cost me in awkwardness or inconvenience. The office building, when I found it, was exactly as unassuming as I'd been told, a modest brick building downtown with no signage, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. I gave my name to a receptionist who seemed genuinely surprised anyone had found the address at all, explained that I had something belonging to Mr. Whitfield that he'd left at my shop, and waited nearly 20 minutes before he appeared himself, walking out from a back office rather than sending an assistant. His expression, when he saw the small leather box in my hand, changed instantly. The easy warmth I remembered from the shop replaced by something urgent, almost frantic, in a way I hadn't expected from a man who'd seemed so unshakably calm days earlier. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tighter than before. "Between your seat cushion and the console," I told him. "I found it doing my final walkthrough after you left." He opened the box carefully, almost reverently, and stared at the ring inside for a long moment before looking back up at me, something raw and unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there before. "This belonged to my wife," he said. "Margaret. She passed away 6 years ago. This ring is the only thing of hers I still carry with me every single day. I don't go anywhere without it in my pocket. I don't know how I didn't notice it was gone." I told him I understood, that I was just glad I'd found it before it ended up lost somewhere in the shop or swept into a drawer and forgotten. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the ring slowly in his fingers. "Do you have any idea how many people would have kept this?" he finally asked. "Or sold it? A ring like this from someone they assumed would never notice or never come looking. You drove across the city to return something you could have quietly kept, from a man you'd met for exactly 3 hours." I told him honestly that keeping it had never crossed my mind, not even briefly, and I think something about the simplicity of that answer affected him more than any elaborate explanation could have. "I built 2 companies by learning to read people quickly," he said. "It's the only skill that ever actually mattered in business, knowing in the first few minutes whether someone is who they present themselves to be, or whether they're performing a version of themselves they think you want to see. You didn't perform anything for me in that shop, Isaiah. You just worked, and you cared about doing it right. And now you've done something most people wouldn't have done for a stranger who could never repay them adequately even if he tried." He extended his hand, and when I shook it, his grip was firmer than before, more deliberate. "I'd like to buy you dinner," he said. "Not to repay you, nothing could really repay this. I'd just like to know more about the man who returned my wife's ring instead of keeping it." I didn't know it yet, sitting in that unassuming office, holding nothing but the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing. But that dinner invitation was about to change the entire direction of my life. Dinner with Julian Whitfield turned into something I never could have predicted sitting, in that unassuming downtown office, holding a stranger's wedding ring. We met at a quiet restaurant 3 nights later, nothing flashy, exactly the kind of understated place I would have expected from a man who drove a 40-year-old Aston Martin and wore a plain gray sweater to conduct billion-dollar business. He asked me questions all evening, about the shop, about my father, about why I'd never expanded beyond the one location despite clearly having the skill to run something larger. I answered honestly. I told him I'd never wanted more than what I had, that the shop gave me exactly the kind of life I valued, steady, honest mine. "That's precisely why I want to talk to you about something," he said, setting down his fork with the deliberate patience of a man who'd learned long ago not to rush the things that mattered. "I don't invest in ideas, Isaiah. I invest in people. I've spent 30 years watching brilliant ideas fail because the person behind them didn't have the character to survive success. And I've watched mediocre ideas turn into empires because the person behind them did. You have something I don't see very often anymore, genuine skill, married to genuine integrity. That combination is worth more than any business plan I've ever reviewed." He proposed something I hadn't considered even as a passing fantasy: funding, fully and without strings, for me to expand my one small shop into a specialty automotive restoration and performance engineering company. The kind of operation that could work on rare classic vehicles and cutting-edge experimental engineering simultaneously, drawing on both my traditional craftsmanship and a new generation of technical talent I'd help recruit and train. "I'm not doing this because I owe you," he said, when I started to protest the scale of it. I'm doing this because I think the world needs more of what you already are, and I have more money than I know what to do with, sitting mostly idle in accounts that do nothing but generate more money. Let me put some of it towards something that actually matters. I said yes. Not immediately. I want to be honest about that, because it would be dishonest to pretend I didn't spend a full week wrestling with whether accepting his offer contradicted everything I believed about building something with my own two hands. But eventually, I understood that Julian wasn't offering to build something for me. He was offering me the tools to build something larger myself, the same way my father had handed me my first wrench decades earlier, and then stepped back to let me actually learn. We called it Cross Precision Motorworks. It started with the same small shop, expanded gradually into the building next door, then the one after that, growing not through flashy marketing but through the same principle that had always guided my work. Reputation earned one honest job at a time. Within 18 months, we were restoring vehicles for collectors across the country. Within 3 years, our engineering division had developed a patented hybrid conversion system for classic vehicles that let owners preserve original bodies and craftsmanship, while modernizing performance, a niche nobody else had filled with genuine expertise. Julian stayed involved, though not in the way I expected. He didn't hover, didn't try to reshape the company into something unrecognizable from what it started as. He showed up occasionally, usually unannounced, usually just to sit in the shop and watch people work, the same way he had that first afternoon. He became, in every way that mattered, something like the father figure I'd lost, present without being overbearing, generous without ever making the generosity feel like leverage. I threw myself into the work the way I always had, except now the work had room to grow into something I'd never imagined possible. I hired people who reminded me of myself at 20, skilled, overlooked, hungry for a chance to prove what they could do without needing anyone's permission to try. I kept the shop's original values even as the company scaled, because I understood, better than most people in my position ever seemed to, that the values were the actual product. Everything else was just machinery. I didn't think much about Vanessa during those years. I want to be honest about that too, because there's a version of this story where I could pretend I spent those years quietly waiting for some cosmic reckoning to find her, but that wasn't true. I was too busy building something that finally, fully belonged to me. Occasionally, news of Ashcroft Vale Partners would cross my radar the way news of any prominent local company does. An expansion here, a controversial leadership decision there. I heard, through channels I wasn't actively seeking out, that Preston had eventually been made a full partner in the firm, that he and Vanessa had married 2 years after my divorce was finalized, that their combined ambition had pushed the company into increasingly aggressive expansion strategies that impressed investors in good years and terrified them in uncertain ones. I heard all of this the way you hear weather reports for a city you no longer live in, relevant in an abstract sense, no longer anything that touched my actual life. Then, 4 years after that Thursday afternoon Julian Whitfield's Aston Martin pulled up outside my shop, I received a call from my company's acquisitions team about a struggling firm they'd identified as a promising undervalued asset. A once prominent consulting company, hemorrhaging clients after a series of leadership missteps. Its market value cut by more than half in 18 months. The company was called Ashcroft Vale Partners. I sat with that information for a long moment after my acquisitions director finished her presentation, the boardroom quiet around me while everyone waited for my reaction. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to dramatize it into something it wasn't. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated in some cinematic way. Mostly, I felt a strange, quiet stillness. The recognition that 4 years of building something honest had led me, without any intention on my part, back to the exact place my old life had ended. "Walk me through what happened to them," I said. The details, once I heard them, weren't especially surprising. Vanessa and Preston had pursued an aggressive national expansion strategy roughly 2 years into their marriage, overextending the company's resources on the promise of contracts that ultimately fell through when a major client relationship collapsed amid allegations of mismanagement. Investor confidence eroded quickly after that. Several senior partners had left, taking key clients with them. What remained was a once formidable consulting firm, now valued at a fraction of its former worth. Its leadership publicly blamed by industry analysts for prioritizing aggressive growth over sustainable strategy. I authorized the acquisitions team to proceed with due diligence, the same way I would have for any other undervalued asset that fit our expansion goals. Cross Precision Motorworks had been diversifying into strategic acquisitions for over a year by then, and Ashcroft Vale's remaining consulting infrastructure genuinely complemented parts of our growing operation. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't chasing Vanessa. I was making a sound business decision that happened to circle back to her. The acquisition finalized 3 months later. I wasn't originally planning to attend the transition meeting myself. Those details typically fell to my executive team. But something made me decide at the last moment that I wanted to be in the room. Vanessa looked older than I remembered, though only 4 years had passed. Not aged badly, exactly, but worn in the particular way ambition wears on people when it stops paying off the way they expected. She sat across the conference table from me, composed as ever on the surface, though I could see something brittle underneath the composure now, something that hadn't been there before. "Isaiah," she said, when she finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the cool authority I remembered from that office 4 years earlier. "I didn't realize Cross Precision was." "I know," I said, not unkindly, just factually. Preston sat beside her, noticeably thinner, his earlier polish replaced by the strained tightness of a man who'd spent the last several years learning that confidence isn't the same thing as competence. He didn't speak much during the meeting. I got the sense he'd learned, the hard way, that speaking without substance behind it had consequences. After the formal proceedings concluded, Vanessa asked if she could speak with me privately for a moment. I agreed, mostly out of the same instinct that had made me return Julian's ring all those years earlier, not because I owed her anything, but because closing a door properly mattered more to me than avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. "I know I don't have any right to ask this," she said, once we were alone, "but is there any version of this where we could talk about more than just business? I've had a long time to think about what I threw away, Isaiah. Watching everything I built with Preston fall apart taught me things I wish I'd understood back when I still had you." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered, because I wanted to make sure what I said next came from clarity, not from any lingering need to punish her. "I'm genuinely glad you've learned something," I told her. "I mean that, but I'm not the man standing in that doorway 4 years ago anymore, waiting to understand what I'd done wrong. I built something real without you, Vanessa, not out of spite and not to prove anything to you specifically, just because building things honestly is who I've always been, and eventually the world caught up to recognizing it. There's no version of this where we go back to what we had, because I'm not interested in going back. I'm only interested in what's ahead of me now." She nodded slowly, and something in her expression, not quite the composure I remembered, but something more genuinely humbled, told me she understood this wasn't a negotiation. "I hope Cross Precision treats what's left of this company well," she said quietly. "It will," I told her. "That's what we do." I walked out of that boardroom without bitterness, without triumph, just a quiet, settled sense of having closed a chapter that no longer needed my attention. Cross Precision Motorworks continues to grow. Julian remains, to this day, the closest thing to a father I have left in this world, and I make sure to tell him that every chance I get. I still work the shop floor myself most weekends, hands in an engine, because that's still the place where everything makes the most sense to me. My father used to say a man's character shows most clearly in how he treats people who can't do anything for him. I've come to understand, in the years since, that it also shows in how he treats the people who once treated him as though he wasn't enough, not with cruelty, and not with forgiveness offered too easily, but with the quiet, unshakable knowledge of exactly who he became without them.